All right. We're going to talk about African imperialism at this point. And one of the key things about African imperialism is that it takes place much later than most of the imperialism around the rest of the world. By the time Africa becomes of interest to the Europeans, they've already settled most of the planet. They've gone out and they've created colonies in Asia, primarily India and Southeast Asia. They've set up trading with China and Japan. They've created colonies throughout the Americas. And Africa has basically just been this big, massive body of land that they've gone around. They've gone into ports, as we saw with slavery. But they really didn't set up a colonial structure. They didn't go in and split up Africa like they did other places and divide it up amongst themselves for resources. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that they really didn't know what was there. And what they were trading for really didn't allow for any belief that there was a lot of value in going in and setting up colonies. So this imperialism is going to take place much later than in most other places and in a slightly different format because there's going to be a big rush for people to gain access to the African continent. So when we talk about imperialism, let's first clarify what it is we are referring to. So imperialism is essentially the control of one country, and in this case, usually a European country, but also could involve the United States. Having control over the economic, political, and cultural life of another place. There's almost a total dominance by the mother country, the European country in most of these cases, over these African colonies and how they're guided. And really, it's all about providing for those European nations. A few reasons we have European imperialism, and this goes across the planet, not just in Africa. But in Africa in particular, we have this legacy of slavery that really creates it creates a solid racist base about what people are all about. And so it almost emboldens Europeans to colonize throughout Africa. Another concept called the white man's burden. This is based on a poem by Rudyard Kipling. And this is really just about if you think about what a burden is a responsibility that's placed upon somebody. And in this case, the Europeans believed it was their responsibility to bring things like Christianity and modern ways of doing things and other aspects of Western culture to the people in other places, particularly in Africa. The Industrial Revolution in Europe is really driving a demand for natural resources and also markets, places where they can sell new products. We have this competition by a lot of different countries in Europe over colonialism because it provides money, but it also provides safe haven and power. So you have the European countries really racing to kind of set up as many colonies as possible. We also have in Europe the rise of nationalism. And this nationalism is based upon really not just a pride in one's country, but also the need for these countries to kind of build up themselves based upon their populations. And then lastly, we do have these international rivalries. These rivalries push countries to build their armies and their navies, and these resources in these colonies provide them with a little bit of that power. This slide really just kind of gives you an idea of how imperialism develops over time. We start with basic native rule in all the areas where the indigenous people have control. The first major European powers to colonize are the Portuguese, the Spanish, and the Dutch. That's kind of the first wave of colonialism. That's followed by the English, French, Germans, Italians, Belgians, and later the Americans. And then World War II and World War I really become turning points. World War I leads to a rise of nationalism in a lot of these colonies. And with World War II, we have independence movements that are going to come along. And we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So I want you to take a look at this cartoon. You can pause this video for a second, but I want you to really analyze this. This is the white man's burden, Rudyard Kipling there in the corner. But this cartoon really shows what the burden is all about. This slide provides you an idea of what the European motives were. We talked a little bit about some of these, but this might give you a little bit more detail. One of the aspects that's discussed is social Darwinism. So we've talked about Darwin and his theories of evolution. Social Darwinism is really the idea of taking this theory of evolution and applying it to human races. And what it did is really justified the exploitation of racism. It really just it put a scientific aspect behind the idea that some races are more evolutionarily advanced than other races, and therefore that you have more superior races and lesser breeds. What this did is it justified that whole idea of the utilization of Africans for slavery or the dominance of Europeans over others. And this is really going to lead to a justification of this whole system of slavery, racism, and colonialism. Social Darwinists were blatantly racist. They believed it was their responsibility to go in and provide for these people who were, tribal and heathenistic and undeveloped. And it was based on this whole idea of survival of the fittest. The idea that they had weapons, so they were more fit. They had modern technologies, so they were more fit. They had modern communication and transportation, so they were more fit than those other people who were in places like African nations. Eventually, we have something called the Berlin Conference. And the Berlin Conference in 1884 is designed to try to prevent a world war. What we have is this race by a lot of European countries to gain access to Africa. And the concern is that this is going to play out in a major war between all of the European nations. What the conference did is it basically divided up Africa among all of these different countries. This resulted in something called the Scramble for Africa, where the African continent was split up from 1880 to 1914 between a lot of different countries. The only place that really was two places that were never conquered or colonized were Liberia, which was maintained as a U.S. territory, and a lot of former slaves went to that area, and Ethiopia that successfully fought off the Italians. This map shows you Africa in 1880 as far as any kind of colonization or intrusion into Africa. You can see everything is essentially along the coastlines. But by 1914, the entire continent, as you can see here, is divided up between these African nations. The color code gives you an idea of who had any kind of power anywhere. And you can see Liberia in West Africa and Ethiopia in East Africa, the two light blue shaded territories. Those two places remained independent. Other than that, the entire continent, in a very short 30-year period, is completely divided up and colonized. In South Africa, we have some unique things that take place. You have some Bantu-speaking people in the Zulu Empire that exists in that area, and they're going to really fight back against some of the Europeans. And the Europeans that are going to fight for the area are the Boers, who are Dutch, and then you also have British who are going to come in. And you have a succession between the Dutch and the British, and a struggle for power over South Africa that leads to what's called the Boer War. So the Boer War is this battle between the Dutch and the British and also the native people in the area over control within this area. What happens is we end up with a white minority population, but we still have the Boers who are going to exist in this area. So you have British control not only over Africans, but also over a minority Dutch population that's going to lead to a lot of distrust and dislike between these various groups. It's going to have an impact on South Africa for a very long period of time. The effects of European rule, the negative impacts are going to mirror a lot of other things that we've talked about, but you have this downgrade of traditional African culture as the European cultures take priority. It's going to lead to forced labor in the form of slavery. Tribalism versus nationalism. This is the tribal culture versus the national identities that are going to rise up and create a lot of problems we'll talk about later. A lack of industry within these areas, a reliance on imported goods from the European countries, and eventually overpopulation in some cities. And then any kind of positive things are really just